Last week, we reported the bombshell news that Robert Wagner has been named a person of interest in the death of his wife, legendary actress Natalie Wood.
She was Hollywood's most radiant star, a woman whose face launched magazine covers, whose voice filled cinema halls, and whose smile convinced the world that some people really do live charmed lives. Natalie Wood had everything: fame, beauty, talent, and a love story the press couldn't get enough of. But on a cold November night in 1981, she vanished from a yacht anchored off Catalina Island, and the world lost one of its brightest lights under circumstances so murky, so deliberately obscured, that 44 years later, we are still asking the same burning question: what really happened to Natalie Wood? Here is the uncomfortable truth. This mystery has not gone unsolved because the evidence was thin. It has gone unsolved because powerful people made sure it stayed that way. But new witnesses, updated forensic analysis, and investigative work that refused to quit have finally assembled a picture. And that picture is deeply disturbing. So today, we're going to walk through everything. The fear she lived with, the marriage she couldn't escape, the night that should never have ended the way it did, and the evidence that points to a conclusion nobody in Hollywood wanted to reach. Buckle up, because the Natalie Wood mystery may finally be solved, and it isn't good. Before we can understand how Natalie Wood died, we have to understand how she lived, because her life was not the fairy tale the studios sold to the public. It was something far more complicated and far more painful. She was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko on July 20th, 1938, in San Francisco, the daughter of Russian immigrants who had crossed an ocean in search of a better life. Her mother, Maria, was a woman of iron will and grand ambition, and she decided, almost from the moment Natalie could walk, that her daughter's face and talent were the family's ticket out of poverty. By the time Natalie was 4 years old, she was being pushed in front of cameras. By the time she was 8, she was a recognized name in American households, thanks to her role in Miracle on 34th Street, playing the sharp little girl who doubted the existence of Santa Claus with a maturity that left audiences stunned. But the price of that early success was steep. Maria's methods of managing her daughter were not gentle. There are accounts of her deliberately traumatizing Natalie on set to produce genuine emotional reactions for the camera, moments of cruelty disguised as professional dedication. The result was a child who learned very early that her emotions were tools to be used by others, that her feelings were less important than the performance, and that the adults around her could not always be trusted to protect her. These are not small details. They are the foundation of everything that followed. As Natalie grew older, she fought back against the child star image with every role she could find. And she succeeded, spectacularly. Her performance in Rebel, Without a Cause, earned her an Oscar nomination at just 17. Her work in West Side Story and Splendor in the Grass confirmed what serious critics already knew. This was not a pretty face being positioned for publicity. This was a genuine, deeply skilled actress. But even at the height of her craft, Natalie Wood was never entirely free. The studio system controlled her image. Her mother hovered at the edges of her career. And then came Robert Wagner. The romance between Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner is one of Hollywood's most enduring stories, and one of its most misunderstood. The public narrative was simple and seductive. Childhood dream becomes adult reality. Two beautiful stars fall in love. The world celebrates. But those who were close to the couple described something far more complicated behind that polished surface. Natalie had been captivated by Wagner since she was a child, long before she ever met him. And when they finally came together in the late 1950s, the relationship moved quickly. They married in December 1957, and the press treated it like a coronation. But within a few years, the cracks were visible to anyone paying attention. By the early 1960s, Natalie was the bigger star by a significant margin. Oscar nominations, major studio roles, critical respect. Wagner, though successful in his own right, was operating in a different league, and that imbalance reportedly created a deep well of tension between them. Sources close to the couple described Wagner as possessive and controlling, particularly when it came to Natalie's professional relationships with male co-stars. The jealousy was not subtle, and it was not occasional. It was a consistent thread running through their marriage. Their first divorce came in 1962, surrounded by whispers and unanswered questions that the era's powerful publicity machine worked hard to suppress. What followed for Natalie was a decade of emotional turbulence, a passionate but exhausting relationship with Warren Beatty, a marriage to British producer Richard Gregson that ended when she discovered he was having an affair with her own secretary. By the early 1970s, Natalie Wood had been burned badly enough by love that many of her friends feared for her emotional stability. And then, almost impossibly, she went back to Wagner. Their reconciliation in 1972 baffled people who knew them. Their second wedding, held quietly on a yacht off Malibu, significantly, on the ocean Natalie had feared her entire life, was presented as a second chance, a mature reunion of two people who understood each other's worlds. And perhaps, for a time, it was. They had children together. They built a family. There were moments of genuine warmth and happiness. But the patterns that had fractured their first marriage did not disappear. Witnesses to their life together described the same possessiveness, the same jealousy, the same tension around Natalie's career ambitions. And Natalie, shaped by a lifetime of being controlled, first by her mother, then by studios, then by the men she loved, found herself once again in a relationship where her own needs were consistently secondary. This matters enormously, because it is the context in which everything that happened on that November night must be understood. There is another layer to Natalie Wood's story, one that only became fully public in 2021, when her younger sister Lana released a book documenting her own investigation into Natalie's death. What Lana revealed reached back decades, to the 1950s, when Natalie was just 16 years old and her mother was engineering meetings with powerful Hollywood figures to advance her daughter's career. According to Lana, Maria arranged for Natalie to meet Kirk Douglas, one of the most powerful and influential actors in the film industry at the time. It was framed as a career opportunity, a strategic introduction that could open doors. What Natalie experienced that evening was something else entirely. She returned home visibly shaken, her clothes disheveled, and she pulled her little sister aside. The words she whispered to Lana were simple and devastating. "He hurt me." Natalie never spoke publicly about what happened. In the Hollywood of the 1950s, that silence was not a choice freely made. It was a survival decision. Young actresses who challenged powerful men faced blacklisting, ridicule, and the systematic destruction of their careers. The studios protected their investments, and those investments were almost always the men. So Natalie carried that wound quietly, burying it beneath the performances and the publicity appearances and the perfect smile that the world expected of her. But trauma does not disappear simply because it is not spoken aloud. Researchers who study the long-term effects of early abuse consistently find that it reshapes how survivors understand relationships, power, and safety. It can make people more susceptible to dynamics where control is exercised by someone they love, because that pattern feels familiar, not comfortable, but familiar. Looking at Natalie's life through this lens, her choices begin to make a kind of heartbreaking sense. The return to Wagner, the tolerance of jealousy and control, the private fears she shared with only her closest confidants. And one of those fears was direct and specific. According to Marilyn Wayne, a woman anchored on a nearby boat who had come to know Natalie, Natalie once told her something that should have been taken far more seriously than it ever was. "Wagner is going to kill me." Those words were not the product of a casual argument or a dramatic moment between spouses. They were, according to those who knew the context, the expression of a genuine, sustained fear. November 27, 1981. Natalie Wood, Robert Wagner, her Brainstorm co-star Christopher Walken, and the yacht's captain Dennis Davern set out on Wagner's boat, the Splendor, for what was meant to be a relaxing weekend near Catalina Island. The weather was poor, the seas were rough, and the mood on board, according to all available accounts, was anything but relaxed. That evening, the group went ashore for dinner at a local restaurant. They drank heavily, champagne, wine, cocktails through the course of the evening. And during that dinner, an argument broke out between Wagner and Walken. The source of the tension was Natalie's career. Walken, direct and unfiltered, reportedly encouraged Natalie to keep pursuing ambitious work, to maintain her professional independence. Wagner, by every account, did not receive this well. He wanted Natalie focused on their marriage and family. He found Walken's relationship with his wife, even a professional one, threatening. They returned to the yacht, carrying that argument with him. And on board, things escalated. Wagner later admitted to smashing a wine bottle on a table in anger. Captain Dennis Davern, who has since spoken extensively to investigators and journalists, described the atmosphere as explosive, Wagner furious, Walken unsettled, and Natalie caught in the middle of a confrontation not of her making. And then, at some point in the night, Natalie Wood went into the water. She was found the following morning, floating approximately a mile from the yacht, dressed in a flannel nightgown, a down jacket, and socks. The small dinghy from the Splendor was found beached nearby. The official explanation offered at the time was that Natalie must have gone out alone to deal with the dinghy, which was allegedly banging against the side of the yacht, lost her footing in the dark, and fallen into the water. But this explanation has never held up to scrutiny, for reasons that are both logical and deeply personal. Natalie Wood was terrified of dark water. This was not a mild anxiety. It was a phobia rooted in a childhood prophecy her mother had told her about, that she would one day die by drowning. Friends and family were unanimous. Natalie would not have gone out alone on dark water, at night, in rough weather after drinking. The idea contradicts everything that was known about her deepest fears. And then there is the question of the dinghy's lines, which were found still tied, suggesting nobody had actually untied the small boat at all. Here is where the investigation fails Natalie Wood most catastrophically, because there were witnesses. There were people who heard things that night, people who came forward, people whose accounts were filed away and forgotten, while the official narrative of accidental death was assembled and sealed. Marilyn Wayne, anchored on a nearby boat, heard a woman crying out from the water sometime around midnight. The voice was desperate and repeated, pleading for help, stating she was drowning. Marilyn heard a man's voice respond, calm, dismissive, and then the screaming stopped. She was so disturbed by what she had heard that she attempted to contact authorities the following day. She was never called to testify. Her account was not incorporated into the official investigation. It was, for all practical purposes, erased. A young deckhand working on a nearby vessel that night has recently come forward, adding his voice to the record. He was 17 at the time, and for decades his account was dismissed or simply never sought. He describes hearing a violent argument aboard the Splendor, the sounds of a woman in genuine distress, things being knocked over, and then sudden silence. His testimony, combined with Marilyn Wayne's, creates a picture of a chaotic, violent night that bears no resemblance to the quiet accidental tragedy that was officially recorded. The autopsy results added forensic weight to these concerns. Natalie's blood alcohol level was well above the legal driving limit, and she had both motion sickness medication and painkillers in her system, a combination that would have severely impaired her coordination and judgment. More significantly, her body showed multiple bruises on her arms, legs, and face, as well as an abrasion on her left cheek. Forensic experts have noted that these injuries were not clearly consistent with a simple fall into water. They suggested the possibility of physical struggle before she entered the water. This was significant enough that in 2012, the Los Angeles Coroner's Office officially amended Natalie Wood's cause of death from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. A quiet but meaningful acknowledgement that the original ruling was incomplete. Dennis Davern, the captain of the Splendor, has become one of the most important figures in understanding what happened that night. He has stated clearly and repeatedly that Wagner was aware Natalie was missing and made the decision to delay contacting the Coast Guard. According to Davern, Wagner told him not to activate searchlights, not to signal other boats, and not to call for help. The Coast Guard was not notified until approximately 3:30 in the morning, more than 4 hours after Natalie was last seen. The boat that recovered her body was not called until after 5 a.m. In cold water, survival time is measured in minutes. That delay was not an oversight. It was a decision. Robert Wagner was officially named a person of interest by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department in February 2018. He has never been charged. He has consistently declined to cooperate with investigators, refusing interviews and avoiding direct questioning about the key hours of that night. Lieutenant John Corina, one of the lead investigators on the case, stated publicly that Wagner's account of events does not align with the testimony of other witnesses present that night. That inconsistency sits at the center of an open wound that 4 decades have not healed. Investigative author Marty Rulli, who has dedicated years to this case, is preparing a new book, Natalie Wood and the Devil She Knew, that argues the available evidence is now sufficient to justify convening a grand jury investigation. Such an investigation would allow for testimony to be taken under oath, for evidence to be formally reviewed, and for the full legal weight of the system to be applied to a case that was never properly examined in the first place. 2 new eyewitnesses have emerged in recent years, adding fresh voices to an already troubling body of evidence. Their accounts align with what Marilyn Wayne described decades ago, reinforcing the picture of a violent, chaotic night that the official record refused to acknowledge. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us that Natalie Wood died in circumstances that were not accidental in any straightforward sense of the word. It tells us that the people who should have raised the alarm chose not to. It tells us that witnesses who came forward were sidelined, that evidence was interpreted in the most convenient direction possible, and that powerful names were shielded by a system that had been protecting powerful names for as long as Hollywood had existed. Natalie Wood was a woman shaped by exploitation, controlled by fear, and ultimately failed by the very structures, family, industry, marriage, that were supposed to protect her. She was afraid of the water her entire life, and in the end, the water took her, while those who could have saved her chose to wait. The mystery of Natalie Wood may finally be solved, but the truth it reveals about who she was, who failed her, and what was done to keep her quiet is not a mystery anyone wanted to confront. Because once you confront it honestly, there is no comfortable place left to stand.